Hello YouTube! I don't know if you've noticed, but there is a new term that is all the rage recently on YouTube and Instagram, and that is the notion of optimal training. Apparently, there is an optimal and a suboptimal way to train for hypertrophy. And if you do certain lifts, then you are just wasting your time because apparently they are bad lifts. This is an idea mostly promoted by what I call biomechanics gurus. It's those guys with an advanced knowledge of the human body that apparently have the ability to say when a lift is good or bad. And therefore, they're also very happy and quick to dismiss certain movements as bad for hypertrophy. Now, I touched on that in the past, and I explained to you guys that the way you approach the lift is going to make it good or bad. But these guys can just tell you across the board that no matter how you planify or program a lift, you would be better off doing something else. And the number one argument is that some lifts, like the deadlift, for example, have a poor fatigue to stimulus ratio. Now, you know me, I love programming, I love getting technical. I've been aware of fatigue to stimulus ratio for years now. And there is something I noticed with that term. Anyone who works in tech is going to relate. Sometimes there's that new jargon, that new scientific term or terminology that everyone starts to use, and when you look around the room, you quickly realize that some of the people that use it don't know what it means. But they don't want to look dumb, so they just go with the flow. It's that meme of, I don't know what this is, and at this point, I'm too afraid to ask. I think that fatigue to stimulus ratio is that for YouTube fitness. Most people don't understand the term, and the guy who popularized it the most is Meatheads. He understands it, but I'm not certain that most of these biomechanics gurus do. So we're going to get to that as well, because the type of ideas and messages they propagate by using what is essentially a buzzword tends to be very toxic, and therefore, you know me, it's something that I'm going to happily combat, because if I perceive that a new ideology is bad for you and therefore is going to lead you to lesser gains, I'm always going to weigh in. And since I recently found what I call a fish, meaning someone I can milk for content, I'll happily do it. A fish is someone in poker that is a weaker player at a table, and you know that you can target them because they don't know how to play, so you'll get lots of money from them. I don't monetize this channel, I'm not after money, I'm after ideas. I hunt and pray ideas because it gives me a platform to share mine so that I can actually help you guys get better. So I will be making more videos calling out biomechanics gurus in the future without naming them because I'm not in it for the drama. Only the ideology matters. And what I'm going to tackle today is this notion of optimal training. Because the very idea that there exists one type of thing that is just optimal and the rest by default and definition must be bad is idiotic in my opinion. It's a case-by-case basis. So right off the bat, this is an attempt at creating something that looks like a one-size-fits-all methodology that is supposed to get everything and everyone big, and that simply doesn't work. I think that this mindset in particular is dangerous because it robs people from the ability to think for themselves. Even though the people that promote it like to present themselves as revolutionaries that try to open the eyes of the sheeple that have been betrayed and have been following suboptimal methods forever, but then you also realize that what they want is for the same sheeple that they're apparently attempting to save to follow their methods blindly. So what I say is, open your eyes, think for yourself. I'm going to give you some things to think about today in this video, and you're going to tell me what you think about optimal training by the end of this segment. So, these very biomechanics gurus have a big target, and that target is the big three. Bench, squat, and deadlift. Of course, this is what they're going to target because this is what most people like to do. This is already a red flag. Why target these lifts? Isn't that just for clout? Isn't that just because people are going to, of course, have an emotional reaction if you go after the bench? A time-tested bench, a time-tested chest method that a ton of people actually love. I think that this already says a lot about the intent of these individuals. And actually, Boredom Man had a great video about that too. It's funny how biomechanics gurus always go after lifts that we love. Like, they never target something like a Bulgarian split squat that no one gives a fuck about. It's always the big three. It's always the big compounds. Why? Well, I think that, again, it's because they have a strategy in mind, and this strategy implies the idea that they want to touch the most people possible. So they look at the lifts that most people like to do, and they just choose from that. At no point do they stop to actually think if a lift has a bad stimulus to fatigue ratio. They take the one that is the most popular and they say, okay, this one is bad for hypertrophy, and then they come up with an answer. Then they come up with a reason. That is not a proper way to offer training methodology. You start with the concept of fatigue to stimulus ratio, and then based on what that represents, you try to find the lifts that fit that very category, that then therefore should be pointed out as bad for hypertrophy. You don't reverse engineer it. You don't start with the deadlift and say, okay, I picked the deadlift, now let me prove to you why it has a bad ratio. No, because now you're biased, you're skewed. Of course you're going to find reasons to explain why the deadlift is a bad lift. I could sit here for 5 hours and explain to you lift by lift why every single movement that you like doing in your program is actually bad. It's very easy, you know why? Because criticizing takes no skills. You can give me the best person on earth and I can write you a 500 pages book explaining to you why they're worse than Satan and Hitler combined. This is not, it's not intellectually honest. It is absolutely unsound to start with. And this leads to very silly explanations because, of course, when you start by saying, okay, deadlift bad, and then you try to explain why, your reasons are most likely going to suck. Just like if you started with the answer of a math problem and then you try to reverse engineer the calculations that got you there, you're going to get 0 because your teacher is going to realize that you're trying to bamboozle him. In this case, I'm the teacher. So the guy in particular that I'm sniping for this video claims that the squat, which is beloved by many and the king of all lower body exercises, is bad because, and I quote, you could lose balance, you could lose your bracing, and you could good morning the weight. None of these are acceptable. These are not reasons why the squat is a bad lift. You could lose balance. How about not losing balance? Can you imagine if you applied this logic to everything else? Don't sprint, you could lose balance. Don't do kettlebell swings, you could lose balance. If you lose balance when you squat, you're an idiot. There, I said it. It's impossible. I've done tens of thousands of reps of squats in my life. I've never lost balance. If you lose balance, there is something wrong with you. Fix yourself. Balance is an important skill to have as a human, but also an athlete. Losing bracing. How? How do you lose bracing? The only way to lose bracing is to, on purpose, just completely release the air that you have. So that's, again, an idiotic reason to say that the squat is a bad lift. Bracing is an integral part of lifting heavy. You need to know how to brace. If you don't know how to maintain the brace, squats are the least of your problem. And then good morning the weight, that's just called proper form. Don't good morning the weight. If you good morning the weight, you're not doing squats properly, so the issue is not the squat, it is with you. You will see that this line of thinking goes back times and times again, because not only do biomechanics gurus think that they're much smarter than the average person, they also think that you listening to them is a fucking idiot. So, if you listen to that type of advice regarding squats, bench, and deadlift, you're essentially being told to not do anything hard and to just stay away from movements that require coordination. What a great idea! Let's all just do movements that take no coordination whatsoever and don't put us at risk. That way, we are all going to get jacked and huge, right? Because it's well known that the best way forward for anyone who wants to improve is to just never take risks. Stay in the harbor, stay a nice shiny boat in the harbor and never actually go into the storm. That has never produced good physics in the history of humanity. So, this is my problem with this line of thinking, because if you look at all of the reasons, you also quickly realize that biomechanics gurus have something to pick, a bone to pick with compound movements. And this is not new. These people have tried for years and years to tell bodybuilders to stay away from free weights, stay away from barbells and dumbbells, and to just stick to machines and cables. It's been 10 years now, and they still attempt it. There's another guy every single year that comes out with arguments, and the arguments tend to always be idiotic. Now, to go back to what I said at the start, with the buzzword of fatigue to stimulus ratio, this is also their big claim. It's the argument they're going to take out of their hats if you counter the previous ones, because they think it's going to confuse you. Because fatigue to stimulus ratio sounds very scientific and it scares people, right? Be careful and watch out for people who like to use big words when they are in a pickle. Usually it's because they are scam artists and they are trying to intimidate you with what they perceive to be advanced knowledge. It's not advanced knowledge because fatigue to stimulus ratio is in reality very easy to understand. It's not rocket science. You have two concepts, fatigue and stimulus, okay? Visualize them side by side. The ratio is the relationship between the two. Each lift gives you fatigue and it also gives you stimulus. That is it, right? This is the concept. It doesn't go beyond that. Now, if you listen to them, apparently compound movements put too much stress on the structure and not enough on the muscle. So the ratio is skewed. You get a ton of fatigue, but you don't get a ton of stimulus because most of the fatigue actually goes towards the structure. So the tendons, the bones, etc., etc. And this is why they will sit there and tell you that machines are better. Because machines are going to give you more stimulus and less fatigue. Now, anyone who understands ratios understands that there is a problem with this line of thinking. Because it's a ratio. And the two things, the fatigue and the stimulus, cannot be separated in this equation. They are not different. They are the same value. It's just that some of each is going to transfer and to transform rather into the other one. It's the fatigue that transforms into stimulus. So if you have less fatigue, you also have less stimulus. The ratio can be more advantageous for a machine, but it could also very well be that the compound movement gives you more of both. In which case, it's only bad if the excess of fatigue overtakes the excess of stimulus. This, again, is not rocket science. It is very easy to understand. It's an argument that is receivable if the argument is that the excess fatigue of compounds could lead to injuries. And this is when things get complicated a tiny bit, because not all fatigue is born equal. And something that I've noticed with machines is that yes, you get less fatigue for the structure, but it tends to be targeted towards one point, because you can also hurt yourself with machines. See, the issue with machines and cables is that yes, they're doing the movement for you. Yes, they keep you within the axis of the movement they were built to be able to replicate. But guess what it means? It also means that they are designed for a certain individual in mind, and therefore, if they cannot be modified, if you cannot modify the angle of the press, for example, you are pressing just like the next guy, but the next guy has shorter arms. What does it mean? It means that you're both using the same movement and leverage, but with different levers, which means that one of you is not adapted for the machine and might get injured. Tons of people get overused injuries using machines. Why? They push in an angle that is not good for them. So the idea that it's impossible to hurt yourself using machines, wrong. It is absolutely possible, because the lesser amount of fatigue you get can be funneled towards one part of the body in particular. Whereas with free weights, you can move your body around the bar. That's sort of the point of free weights. They are designed to allow the individual lifter to adapt their form to them. And yes, it takes some practice. Yes, it takes some learning, but you're going to be lifting for 10 years anyways. So why not do it? Another argument is machines are easier to learn. Are we talking to people who are going to be in the gym for 2 weeks then leave? I mean, I'm sure biomechanics gurus are, because they talk to noobs, they try to appeal to noobs with their methods. But for anyone else, don't you actually want to learn new skills? Don't you want to coordinate yourself with new compound movements? That's exactly that. You also always notice, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's important to say, that these people target lazy asses. They target dudes that are going to be afraid of compound movements, and instead of just pushing them through it, no, they soothe them. They give them excuses. They tell them, oh, no, compounds are not that great anyways. You can stick to your machines. You know what this does? It keeps people small. I've seen times and times again people, especially in France, because it's a country full of wimps, people who start the gym, they're intimidated by barbells and dumbbells, so they stick to machines and cables because they're more welcoming and easier to use, and they never go anywhere because they stick to that. They never actually move on to free weights, and therefore maybe they get a better stimulus to fatigue ratio, but they also get less of both. That is the issue with machines. You don't get as much. Why? The machine lifts some. And if you don't believe me, compare a bench press and a bench press with a machine. I'm not even talking about these bullshit machines where you press in front of you, or you can put 5 plates. I'm talking about one where you're laying on your back and you're pushing up just like you would with a bench press. You can always put so much more weight on these. You know why? Because the machine is doing most of the work for you. It's like the Smith machine. Does it mean that machines don't work the muscle? No. But it does mean that you can use more weight. What does it mean? It means that to get the same ratios of fatigue and stimulus, you need to use more load. What does it tell you ultimately? That machines have a lower ratio overall, even though they might have a better ratio between the two factors. If you don't get that, and most biomechanics gurus don't get that, don't use the term stimulus to fatigue ratio because it is not going to be used properly. You're just going to misinform people. Now, to get back to what I was saying, the problem also is that it babies people. This mindset babies people. You need to allow people to grow up, all right? And the problem where you constantly try to take people away from lifts that have a poor fatigue to stimulus ratio is that you never let them learn. As I explained to you, a deadlift, for example, has a bad fatigue to stimulus ratio if you do too much volume, because now you did so much work that your fatigue cannot justify the amount of stimulus you received, or vice versa instead. The amount of stimulus you receive from the deadlift doesn't justify the fatigue, the systemic fatigue, and now you have to pay somewhere else in the program. That would be you. It's not the lift. The problem isn't with the ratio. It's with you not being able to handle the ratio, because again, the ratio is a value of both factors that transform into one another and communicate with one another. So it's your responsibility to deal with it. Biomechanics gurus might maybe understand that, but what they do, instead of telling people to learn the lifts, is they just tell them to stay away from them. That's not my way, right? I've never babied you on this channel. I think you have the ability as a human, the cognitive ability to understand concepts, to apply them, and to learn. If you follow these guys, however, you will remain idiotic forever because they will keep you away from the dangerous stuff. You know, we should start putting those baby barriers around machines and cables and call it baby playground in the gym, because this is where the baby and the boys hang. And sure, you can build good muscles with that, and I know a ton of advanced lifters who use these machines, but they use it as a complement. They never start there. At some point, you have to learn, you have to take the risk. You have to stay away from safe methods, because safe methods overall will give you less tonnage. And if you end up not following that advice and you stay within baby playground, what happens is you never learn proper fatigue management. Let's go back to what I said previously. Fatigue turns into stimulus. There is no such thing as a lift that only gives you stimulus. Biomechanics gurus tend to think that that's the case for machines. Like you only get the good stuff. Does that sound realistic? No. Every single lift gives you fatigue because it's the fatigue that turns into the stimulus. You cannot, again, separate the two. So if you're going to, at some point, need a lift that is going to give you more or both, this is going to be a compound movement. You're going to have to learn how to load tendons and the structure properly. And the only way to do that is going to actually be to do these movements. Now, another thing I would like to point out is that apparently, according to these types, doing machines and cables is better for longevity. And this is also a very childish mindset, because they think that if you don't load the structure or load the tendons, this is somehow going to promote longevity because you're going to be able to use them more later. Again, I have news flash for these people and anyone who thinks like this. Tendons exist to be loaded. Your spine exists to be loaded. You're not made of sugar. You're supposed to lift heavy shit. There is a reason why we have the structural ability to squat, for example. You don't fold in half like a pretzel when you squat. Why? Because your body is able to do that. It's a safe way to load a movement of knee flexion. And if you follow the type of advice that biomechanics gurus actually tout, the problem is that you're going to go into your old age thinking, oh, I saved all of my tendon capital and I'm going to be so healthy. Wrong. You never trained your tendons. So when your muscles are going to start deteriorating because you're aging, what is going to happen? Now your tendons have to take over, but they've never been trained. So you're going to fall apart. Tendons need to be trained. Forget about the idea that if you squat in your 30s, you're never going to be able to walk in your 60s, or you have a knee replacement or a hip replacement. That is only true for people who push the bill, who end up with too much fatigue. That's not you. You're a bodybuilder. We have methods to handle fatigue. You're going to be just fine. You're going to be fine because you will have understood that tendons activate muscles, that the two work hand in hand, and that it's perfectly fine to train them both. We, of course, want to prioritize muscle, but it's a childish fantasy to think that you can only activate the muscles. It is simply not how it works. Machines also activate the tendons, and because again they are in a fixed rep range and a fixed leverage, they can sometimes create issues with said tendons. Now, I'm going to share a quote with you, and you tell me what this makes you think about. If you think valued as an adult, or if you feel babied. Training close to failure when squatting, benching, and deadlifting with a barbell requires an incredibly high level of skill that most people don't have. Is it you? Are you the idiot that rode the short bus that apparently is not able to bench properly? Like when you bench, you're going to drop it on your neck and die? Are you the idiot that cannot deadlift because when they deadlift, they just drop the weight on their toes? I mean, who are these people talking to? I feel insulted just reading that. Like, I don't have the mental capacity and intellectual ability to be able to squat properly. That is so reductive. This is what I call, and I didn't coin it, it's a very well-known term, the bigotry of low expectations. It's when you think people are so dumb and so incapable that you just give them like entry-level advice, you baby them again. But you know what this does? There is something, and I've shared that in the past, called the Pygmalion effect. And the Pygmalion effect shows and demonstrates that the way you treat people has an impact on the way they perceive themselves and therefore how they perceive their own potential. If you're a teacher and you tell your students that they're dumb and therefore you lower the grades or you lower the material you teach them because you want to adapt to their measly level, you create idiots because you lower their potential and their ceiling. Whereas if you believe in them and you go into certain material that is out of their comfort zone, it challenges. Can I speak English properly, please? It challenges them. That was tough. Immigration is going to be there any second to kick me out. My English is pathetic. It challenges them, and therefore it also pushes their ceiling upwards. What biomechanics gurus do is they take your ceiling and they bring it all the way the fuck down. They keep you with baby shit like machining cables, and they never actually allow you to learn. To learn a skill, you have to actually try. You have to actually fail. On top of that, if you look at this, squatting, benching, and deadlifting, aren't these movement patterns? Because these are not lifts. A deadlift is not a lift. It's one type of hip hinge. By doing that, what biomechanics gurus do is they shun all types of variations. Because if benching is bad, then any type of horizontal pressing variations is bad. So goodbye Larson press, goodbye close grip bench press, goodbye GM presses. Deadlifting is bad, goodbye Romanian deadlift. Goodbye stiff leg deadlift, goodbye shrugs. If squatting is bad, goodbye front squat. All of these leaves out the window. How? Funny how that functions. What are you left with? Cables, machines, almost as if these people had an agenda against compound movements. And of course, they'll tell you that, well, a hack squat is still a compound movement. Correct. And I'm glad that you noticed that, my imaginary friend I just made up as a straw man, because I'm going to make a video very soon about the distinction between machines and compound movements and free weights, based again on what biomechanics gurus have to say, and I'm going to show that once again the arguments they use to promote machines, because of course they always promote the machine variation, tends to also be a load of crap. Now, as I said, this mindset, the one that I'm trying to combat in this video of optimal training, indirectly demonizes compound movements. I say indirectly because those gurus don't even have the balls to go out and say that it's what they're trying to do, because again, what they really want is they really want the clout. This is why they target these lifts. If tomorrow the pendulum shifted and people started to favor machines, for example, they would come up with reasons to explain to you why machines are not so great after all, and now you have to do movements with kettlebells or whatever. This is their big plan. And it leaves people with the worst exercises available to build a body, something that I already tried to explain to you guys. Now, I must say that I understand where they're coming from, and I understand why they're doing that, because it's exactly what I'm trying to do as well. We're both trying to shift the paradigm. I perceive the paradigm on YouTube to be toxic because it is too powerlifting centric, and when it's not powerlifting centric, it's overtaken by bodybuilding baboons on drugs that don't know how to give good advice. That also coincidentally tend to also promote machines and cables. What a surprise. But The issue with the methods of biomechanics gurus is that they are making the mistake that has been made times and times again. They see that people over focus on bench, squat, and deadlift, do it with improper rep ranges, don't do enough variation, don't do enough isolation, but instead of taking the pendulum and putting it in the middle, no, they let it swing all the way to the other side, not realizing that this is also an extreme that doesn't work, which means that these people don't know their history. Because if they knew their history, they would also know that all of the natural lifters of the past, before PEDs, built their bodies using compound movements, every single one of them. And this is still true to this day. If you look at people who have great physiques, you will notice that these tend to be people who use a majority of compound movements and then complete their training with machines, cables, isolation. But you can't just have the rest, you can't have the cherry on top of the cake and put it on a plate and think it's going to be a great feast. You're missing the cake. Do not miss the cake. Understand that there is a balance in everything, but that the ideology promoted by biomechanics gurus is not a balance. Because they're trying to tell you that if you use these compound movements, these movements that you use, you are somehow just being blinded by your emotions and you're not training optimally. Which, in retrospect, is funny because even the claim of optimal training is emotion-based. It's not evidence-based as they would like to tell you. And even if it was evidence-based, understand that evidence is not truth. Evidence can also be dismissed, as I was doing in this video. Now, of course, because I promote compound movements, because I promote training hard, they will point to me and call me a meathead. Because apparently, you have two choices in life. You can either be a complete Poindexter with no muscle mass whatsoever, but a ton of theoretical knowledge about stimulus to fatigue ratio, or you can be a meathead and be big. I think there's a middle ground here. I think that most naturals that you follow on this page, on this platform, tend to not be complete idiots. They tend to know what they're talking about. But I've also noticed that this new era of the 𝚂𝙷 biomechanics guru that is supposed to save the world from unoptimal training sort of flops, because when you look at the guys, they have no physiques. It's a common pattern with these dudes where they know so much, but their physique doesn't reflect that. What is going on, bud? Now, if you met someone who's apparently a killer physicist, but they can't apply their knowledge for shit, wouldn't you have questions to ask? Well, there's no question to ask because I already have the answer for you. These people don't actually try their own methods, or if they try them, these methods don't really get them anything because they don't actually work. What works is time-tested, has survived the passage of time, whereas I guarantee you that all of these gimmick lifts that are pushed by biomechanics gurus will be forgotten in 1 year's time. So you have a choice to make. Do you want to train optimally, like these guys say, or do you want to train the way your ancestors have that has produced great results? I'm going to leave you with that very difficult conundrum to solve, and I will be back eventually because, again, I want to make more videos discussing compound movements being bad for hypertrophy, the squat being horrible for your legs, the best tricep exercise according to these guys. I have found a gold mine, so don't mind me if I mine. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.